Welcome back to One Piece Explained. Chapter 1125 seems to be the world-shaking conclusion to the Egghead arc that we've been waiting for, as we finally get some resolution on certain plot threads, while setting up even more. And in this breakdown, I'll be going through everything about Saturn's demise, why he could still come back, Garling's promotion, the Vegapunks' next moves, and much more. So without saying much else, let's get right into Chapter 1125, What Death Means. We get our 13th entry in the Ogre Child Yamato's Golden Harvest Surrogate Pilgrimage cover story, as we find Yamato having finally made their way to Kuri. It seems the reconstruction of Oden Castle has started now that Orochi and Kaido's reign has ended, but missing among the carpenters is Minatomo. This was the carpenter whom Frankie worked under when he arrived in Wano, and is also the relative of the Minatomo who was first introduced in the SBS as a gag character to account for the inconsistency of a broken door that was fixed between panels. We would later learn that these two characters were related, and Minatomo was actually part of the group of people who left Wano to settle in the East Blue. This all comes on the heels of the last chapter's cover story entry, where we learned that someone was running around Kuri abducting people. And with this, we're definitely starting to see a pattern emerge, and maybe on the cusp of the main conflict of this cover story. I'm excited to see where this goes next. Also of note in the background, you can make out a bull helping out with the construction. This looks to be Home, who Ashura Doji once rode as a mount. We hadn't seen him since before the raid, and I suppose it only makes sense that he stayed behind in Kuri after his master's death. While most of the folks here helping in construction look to be carpenters based on the kanji on their clothing, I do wonder if some of Ashura Doji's Atamayama thieves are also helping out here. But enough of that, now onto the chapter itself. We pick things back up on Egghead and find the Marine and World Government packing up the various technologies on the island. Lucci reports that he has killed Stussy, with Kaku holding back his emotions from behind. Now, the Cypherpole agents asking about Stussy is pretty interesting, as it may suggest that the World Government has not yet been informed about her betrayal. At the start of the day, Doberman reported that they had not received a report from CP0 just yet, and when reviewing their current intel, he listed Stussy alongside Lucci and Kaku without mentioning any word of her betrayal. Of course, Lucci was sending information to Kizaru throughout the siege earlier in the day, so perhaps that information has not just yet been disseminated. Recall that last we saw her, Kaku was telling her to leave or else she would be killed by Lucci, and it could be the case that Lucci already actually ended up disposing of her, but I would imagine we would have gotten that scene in real time. As such, I think it's much more likely that she managed to escape, though that begs the question here, does he truly think she was killed? Kaku could be covering for her and reported back to him that she died after she intercepted his finger pistol, which I feel is probable, but it would be very interesting if Lucci was also in on it and allowed her to escape more recently. Time and time again, we've seen Lucci be a loyal dog to the world government, but I have to always wonder if he'll have a tipping point, especially with all of these revelations about the world government across this arc and how the elders don't value their men. It's bound to make some of the government agents start to question things, and we actually get some of that in this chapter as we find Saturn convening with the 9 vice admirals who were part of this operation. It's nice to see that they've all made it out alive despite some of their defeats, and interestingly, Red King is depicted with his right arm obscured by Saturn's head, hiding the mechanical limb state after being destroyed by Frankie, though we sort of get a brief glimpse of what it looks like later on in the chapter as the vice admiral is flung back, showing what may be wires dangling off the end. Now, Saturn mentions that while they have succeeded in their 3 goals that were outlined at the start of the day, with them securing York, Punk Records, and the Mother Flame power plant, there was one major issue that arose. The Vice Admirals presumed this to be the escape of the Straw Hats, but Saturn of course is speaking of the broadcast of Vegapunk's message and the unexpected involvement of the Iron Giant Emmet. And with this, we get a pretty huge twist as we come to find out that it was actually Saturn himself who had ordered the preservation of the Iron Giant 200 years ago. Earlier in this arc, when the robot was first introduced, we were told by Vegapunk that it was ordered to be destroyed by the world government, but the scientists were too curious and had it hidden on Egghead behind the government's back. As it turns out, Saturn had wished to study it and use it as a military force, which does make a lot of sense given his role as the godhead of science and defense, but it also means he directly disobeyed an order from the world government, and presumably Emu himself. This brings up a lot of very interesting implications here. First and foremost, Saturn's undoing being his own greed puts him in a clear parallel to Vegapunk in this arc, and goes to show that he is not this infallible superior being that the Celestial Dragons maintained themselves as. Saturn gloated and lectured Vegapunk about how the scientist's pursuit of knowledge led to his own demise, though the difference is, Vegapunk has fully prepared for the outcome of his actions, while Saturn was arrogant enough to believe his betrayal would not be found. Furthermore, it also indicates that the 5 elders, despite being able to communicate with one another telepathically, do not have some sort of omnipotent link with each other or Emu, or else they would have all known about Saturn's betrayal. As we saw earlier, Mars and Mercury were both surprised to see the Iron Giant on the island. And I suppose this all should have been evident by now, as the elders are constantly seen asking Emu questions via transponder snail instead of just instantaneously knowing what Emu desires. Though, we did see Emu feel Joy Boy's hockey from the other side of the world, so that may indicate some sort of physiological connection, and on top of that, we do see some telepathic communication with Emu later on in this chapter, but more on that in just a bit. This flashback is also some hard confirmation that the elders do not age. Fans have always suspected this, and it was further suggested earlier in the arc when we saw Saturn with the same appearance 38 years ago. But I guess at the time, you could argue that an old man would not change too much in 4 decades, given how people in this world can live into their hundreds. But maintaining that exact likeness for 200 years should definitely put the final nail in the coffin on that theory. This may also give us some context for how long the elders have existed with these abilities. Fans have long speculated that not all of the elders may have been alive during the Void Century, and back when Luffy first awakened Gear 5th, the elders were asking questions amongst themselves, prompting fans to believe that some of them knew more than others. Personally, I believe this to just be an expositional device to give information to us as readers, but the possibility was always there. Now with this flashback, it may suggest that Saturn was unaware of Emmett's affiliation with Joy Boy, though it's hard to say for certain since we have had Saturn specifically address Luffy as Nika before. This chapter brings up a ton of questions regarding how the Elders' abilities work, when they came to power, and more that I'll address in just a bit. As we flash back to present day, Doberman brings up the elephant in the room as he realizes that viewing Vegapunk's message as an issue suggests that there could be some truth behind that information. This line of questioning, of course, displeases Saturn, as we see his eye technique used once again here to impact Doberman's head and knock him back. I've spoken about this before on the channel, but I think it's clear by now that Saturn never had the ability to make people's heads explode as many fans wanted to believe. This was initially thought to be the case, since the first use of his ability made it seem like he completely took off a Marine soldier's head, but as we can see in hindsight, that was only the result of the angle at which we saw it from. Every other instance has involved the target being knocked back head first, and it makes a lot of sense when looking at that Marine soldier as well, since if the head exploded, the Marine cap would not have fallen back at that angle and would have simply fallen from the top of the soldier's head. Whereas there, it's more than likely because the head was knocked back into that position for the cap to fall off, much like how we see Doberman in this chapter. It's also quite fitting for Doberman to be the one having these thoughts here, as earlier in the day, he was also the one asking Saturn about the safety of the government forces on the island, which Saturn disregarded entirely. He was also shown to be a bit pensive during the Buster Call of Eni's lobby, as he saw cracks in Spandam's lies about Aokiji giving him these orders, and throughout the Battle of Marineford, we saw Doberman actually be quite harsh, not caring about the well-being of his own men and prioritizing the victory, but it feels like he may have developed his philosophy a bit since then. I wouldn't be surprised to see him among the various Marines and government agents who continue to question their place in all of this. We revisit Mary Joie and find the Celestial Dragons still outraged over Vegapunk's message and get the quiet part out loud as one of them says the world sinking is none of their concern, something that we've speculated on for quite a while now since they live up so high on the red line. It seems the food shortage caused by the actions of the Revolutionary Army has continued to be a thorn at the side of the Celestial Dragons. One of them even decides to kill a chef who was unable to prepare the order that was requested, who also looks to be starving himself. Other Celestial Dragons discuss who should be punished for this, which makes me wonder if they'll continue to pin this on Sakazuki, or if they'll be able to repurpose Saturn's death and blame him for everything that went wrong at Mary Joie recently. Speaking of, we get quite a twist here as Saturn drops to his knees and a black substance starts flowing out of his mouth and body. Now it's hard to say for sure if this is supposed to be black smoke, akin to what we saw when Saturn and the Elders were being summoned, or if this is actually related to the black clouds or Hagoromo that we see awakened Zoans with. This is somewhat reminiscent of what happens to the victims of the Shadow Fruit, but here we see Saturn seemingly start to rapidly age as well, as if his immortality has been taken away. Not only that, we get some dialogue from Emu and Saturn, though it's not exactly clear if they're specifically talking to each other or just saying things and thinking things independently that happen to line up. It would seem that Emu's frustration with Saturn is not from any of the failures they faced leading up to the completion of their initial mission, but rather, Emu seems focused on Joy Boy escaping, which was directly the result of Saturn allowing Emmett to be hidden behind the world government's back. As a sidebar, I'm pretty happy with that flashback's inclusion in this chapter as providing the core of the reasoning behind this scene here. If Emu had simply decided to pin all of the shortcomings of the Egghead operation on Saturn, it would feel like a little bit too much, as if Emu was a mustache-twirling villain who would kill his closest, most capable men on a whim, especially since a lot of the blame also falls on the other elders for not being able to do things like kill Bonnie, a 12-year-old child. But since we learned that Saturn actively betrayed the world government and directly caused a huge problem for them by preventing Emmet from being destroyed, this kind of retaliation by Emu feels a lot more appropriate. Saturn calls out to Emu in his thoughts and begs for forgiveness, explaining that he didn't consider Joy Boy's abilities would get in their way like this. Interestingly, he also calls out Emu's name physically in front of all of the Vice Admirals, though given that he's been wailing out in pain this whole time, I would be surprised if any of the Marines were able to understand the significance of that utterance. This exchange sort of reminds me of the end of Wano, when Shanks and Ryokugyu had a back and forth that wasn't entirely clear if they were actually talking to one another or not. I've speculated before on the possibility of using haki to communicate, and I have to wonder if there's some greater application of that at play here in this scene, as it climaxes with a huge explosion involving black smoke and what looks to be black lightning, once again invoking the imagery that we saw when the elders were summoned to Egghead. Across these panels, Saturn's amorphous blobby form is also very reminiscent of when we first saw the elders had abilities, though of course that was more than likely to obscure their appearances. That said, we also got more similar warped silhouettes when the elders were first being summoned to the island. Whatever is going on with them, it seems that the core of the elders is some sign of humanity, as nothing but a skeleton is left after the explosion. Given this, along with the accelerated aging we saw, it seems the elders were actually humans who were augmented with what we can only presume was Emu's abilities, granting them immortality and invulnerability. Though nothing is confirmed just yet, it would seem Emu bestowed these powers onto each elder at a certain point in their life, allowing them this status, and I guess this may also suggest that the elders were not actually recipients of the perennial youth operation as many had speculated, with that likely being received by Emu. Now, the number one rule of death scenes is that in order to completely write someone off as dead, you need to see the body, and this is probably the most explicit instance of that we've ever had in One Piece, but even so, I hesitate to say that this is the last of Saturn. There's a lot of what looks to be black magic here, or at least unexplained abilities at play from Emu's side, so I have to wonder if there's some means of Emu just bringing Saturn's form back at a later point if needed. But even beyond that, there is a weird inconsistency here with the skeleton itself. Across several panels, we see Saturn begin to age and wither away, and throughout these, we also see him seemingly lose his teeth as they fall out. However, at the end, all that's left is a skeleton, and on the skull, we see a full set of teeth. This could easily just be a mistake from Oda, or perhaps the teeth weren't actually falling out in these earlier panels and instead just being obscured by the black substance, but I did want to draw some attention to it in the small chance that this is supposed to be a tell that Saturn is not actually gone for good, and the skeleton we see is not actually his. But either way, this death scene is certainly one of a kind for the series at large, and it happening in front of a group of Vice Admirals is surely going to cause some questions. How will they cover it up? Who will get blamed? I'd imagine this also further pushes them toward Doberman's line of thinking, where they begin to realize there's some greater power or motivation at play that they're unaware of. We'll just have to see where it goes from here. But now, this brings us to who exactly will be taking over for Saturn now that he's been dismissed, to say the least. Back over at Mary Joie, Saint Figurland Garling barges into the Hall of Power, much to the other elders' surprise. This scene is actually quite reminiscent of when Shanks approached the elders in this room as well, with him being suspected to be a Figurland. Of note, Mars is once again standing, even after having been shown sitting when waiting for the other elders. It was recently pointed out in Volume 109's SBS that Mars is often shown standing even when seating is available. The elders question his presence here and ask who it is that gave him these instructions, though given everything, we should suspect it to be Emu by this point. Also of note, Garling enters here with a cloak over his new suit, which is what the elders put on when they went to see Emu back during the reverie. With this, we get the reveal that Garling has now replaced Saturn as the godhead of science and defense and will be overseeing York going forward. This news startles the others, as they've seemingly come to realize that Saturn has been dismissed, and Jupiter in particular seems quite upset by this news. This brings up a whole discussion about just how the 5 elders are chosen. There used to be a speculation that each of the 5 elders had been around since the Void Century, but as the story progressed, it seems that this may not necessarily be the case. Have there been different iterations of the 5 elders throughout the centuries, or is this the first time that we've had a new replacement? Also, does this mean Garling has been bestowed demonic powers and immortality as the others have been as well? If so, this would also work to explain why the elders have the appearances they do with their age and scars, since they would have been given their power and status later in life. I've talked before about how I believe that Jupiter may actually have been the first elder who was given his abilities early on in life, explaining why he is so young relative to the others, with this somewhat being supported by the numbering on their summoning circles. Saturn was shown with 5s, while Mars was shown with 4s, Mercury's with 3s, and Neutrinos with 2s, which would of course leave Jupiter's with 1. This also corresponds to the order in which their demonic powers were named, starting with Saturn and ending with Jupiter. Speaking of appearances, it's also pretty interesting that Garling's design actually resembles a star when looking at him from the front. Upon his introduction, the moon motif was clearly evident with his hair and beard, but the star imagery is now revealed to us with his formal reintroduction as a Gorosei, or 5 Elder Star. Very cool stuff going on here with Oda's designs, and I also love how his hair separates him from the rest of the elders in this panel, once again playing into the sense of discord or tension in this group. And of note, if it wasn't clear enough that he's replacing Saturn, he comes in and immediately sits in his seat, cementing his position as the godhead of science and defense. That does beg the question, what does Garling know about science? Being the commander of the Holy Knights, I'm sure he has adequate experience when it comes to warfare and security, but overseeing scientific needs for the government seems a bit out of his realm as far as we know. I think this really speaks to the world government's current situation, where they've ignored Vegapunk's technologies that could be used to better help the world, and instead have focused on any of his inventions that could be used for military purposes. The world is facing major ecological disaster, and the government has chosen to assassinate their leading scientific powers and replace them with a military leader. Such stances are of course also common in our real-world governments, with many prioritizing power and military might over the well-being of the planet and its people. And this brings me to the last but not least part of this chapter, with the scientists who we thought to be dead. Well, sort of. Back on the Labo phase, we find York seemingly waking up amongst the ever-expanding clouds from below. As suspected, Edison was not actually dead, but instead had more to his seemingly rash plan, as we see that he created more clouds to try and lift the Labo phase off the island. Unfortunately, York manages to prevent the entirety of the Sky Island from leaving, and only Punk Records is taken, but a huge win for the Vegapunks nonetheless. Though this does mean the world government is still in possession of the power plant to produce Mother Flame, which puts the government in a much better spot. We also finally get to see what York's bazooka ended up being used for, as she's had it for a little while now, and it turns out it's more of Vegapunk's laser technology. As Punk Records flies through the sky, we get hard confirmation that it can still be connected to from across the world by its users. Recall that Vegapunk's eventual goal was to allow it to be accessed by everyone on the planet. This is also the reason why Lilith was able to get that download of information about the others being alive, though I have to imagine York should now suspect the rest of the Vegapunks have survived as well. It seems that while Punk Records is where the Vegapunk's brain is stored, it's also where their extra body parts are, as we see a room full of spare satellite parts. This was first mentioned earlier in the arc when Atlas's face was broken off by Lucci, and you can spot additional faceplates for her here, as well as headpieces for Edison, Shaka, Lilith, York, and even Pythagoras, though there are several components that don't really line up with any of the satellites. For example, there's some that resemble Pythagoras, but is rectangular. It could be a prototype of sorts, but there's also one that doesn't quite match up with anyone else off on the side. I suppose these could all just be additional prototypes, or perhaps there's some possible future where we get a new satellite or a different appearance for the current ones. These could even be spare parts for some of the researchers on the island. Either way, we get Edison's new appearance, which is basically an amalgam of all the other dead satellites, with Pythagoras and Atlas's arms, Shaka's torso and legs, and they also have a jetpack that's proportional to Shaka's body. Perhaps the most interesting part of this sequence, however, is their mention of other allies, as we leave off with Edison phoning Haridas on Weatheria. We saw the weather researchers of this island not too long ago during Vegapunk's message, and it seems they were actually tuned in as well, as Haridas thought Vegapunk to be dead. Vegapunk did speak on the importance of cloud technology just a few chapters prior, and as we know, Weatheria is an artificial sky island, just as Punk Records now is. Lots of interesting possibilities to come if the Vegapunks have been working with the researchers of Weatheria this whole time, but I suppose it only makes sense that they were. Also of note, Haridas is a Birkin, just like Enel, which feels fairly important as we start to approach the history of the world and as we start to approach Elbaf. We end the chapter off checking in on the Revolutionary Army. Koala seems to be recapping the important points of Vegapunk's message, and we get some confirmation on our speculation over the last several months that the Celestial Dragons settled on the Red Line to remain unconcerned about the rising sea levels, as well as the existence of things such as Tequila Wolf that sit high above the sea level were in preparation for that future. We also get the names of some other similar mega structures: Vodka Wolf, Rum Wolf, and Bourbon Wolf. I presume these are labor sites in the other blues, and in fact, we may have actually seen one of them earlier in this arc. We initially assumed it to be Tequila Wolf, given the presence of the familiar jailer, but perhaps he was just reassigned after the Revolutionary Army liberated the place 2 years ago. Either way, we close off with Dragon urging the need to take action for the sake of the world, as Vegapunk's message is sure to cause even more panic and violent claims for dry land. Whether they like it or not, the revolution needs to happen sooner rather than later, and as such, it may finally be time for Dragon to make his move. That's about it for all the things that I wanted to talk about in this chapter. So much great stuff going on here, and I'd love to read what you all thought about it in the comments. Thank you so much for watching, stay safe, and I hope to see you in the next one.